Let's get started. Welcome. We are thrilled to have you join us today for our first in a series of Lunch and Learns being hosted this summer by Mariana Strategies. What we found was that this is a topic well worth addressing. And what I want to share with you today is who I am. My name is Audrey Ruffet, and I'm here with my colleague, Swati Srivastava, and we are from Mariana Strategies, based in Washington, D.C. and in Chicago, and our focus is on building inclusive, safe, and equitable workplaces. And we're here hosting the series to talk about not the new normal, but the next normal. We had been facilitating discussions with client organizations all throughout the pandemic. And earlier this year, we heard about a leader of an organization who said, why can't we all go back to the office 5 days a week? Nothing has changed. And in that moment, we realized that a lot of things have changed for a lot of people, but for some it hasn't. And it's really important that we're having discussions about ensuring that the return to the workplace is an equitable one, is an inclusive one. And we are having that discussion starting here today. So we're thrilled to have you. Today is our first discussion, and we'll be talking about some practices that will be applicable across a variety of workplaces as we transition into that next normal, into that hybrid workplace, into what a new model can look like. And our upcoming events this summer include beginner strategies for organizations that are starting to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but may not know where to begin. We're going to support that conversation by talking about the 3 pillars of an inclusive workplace, how we can measure inclusion, and the 3 key strategies for building inclusion at work, which focuses on building norms, creating trust, developing empathy. And that's what beginner strategies look like. We will also be looking on July 22nd at that question. On August 12th, we will be focusing on inclusive leadership strategies, what leaders need to know that's crucial to their DEI efforts using change management principles, how leaders can use empathy and self-awareness to understand DEI challenges, the essential communication skills of transparency, vulnerability, and accountability, and applying inclusive leadership to critical organizational functions, recruitment, hiring, retention, measuring people against inclusive culture values, ensuring performance reviews are bias-proof. We could go on. And then on September 2nd, we'll be talking about the role we all play in making workplaces more inclusive, but how we get there when it's not easy and when people don't feel equipped to make change. So that day we'll be talking about leading into discomfort as a tool for growth, focusing on impact over intent, and more. And so as we're getting ready for those conversations, we welcome your questions. Now I'm going to share a little bit about myself and then have my colleague Swati introduce herself. My name is Audrey Ruffet. My pronouns are she and hers. I am the founder and CEO of Mariana Strategies. I started this business in 2017. It was in response to the landslide movement around the Me Too hashtag that started then and has only snowballed and is more than relevant even today. The questions that we started by tackling in 2017 focus on how we're able to create inclusive, equitable environments where everyone can thrive and focus on doing their work, whatever that work is. I'm a certified change management practitioner, licensed attorney in Washington, D.C. and in New York State, and I have 15 years of litigation experience, nonprofit management, and advisory services experience. Now I want to turn it over to my colleague, Swati.
Hi, everyone. My name is Swati Srivastava. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a social psychologist. I come from a background of organizational consulting and nearly 2 decades of survey research. I represent the Chicago office of Mariana Strategies. I joined the firm in response to this crazy past 15 months that we've seen. I was looking for work that I felt passionate about, and I'm super excited to be here at our first Lunch and Learn with you all.
Thank you, Swati. So we're going to tell you a little bit about what we do, and then we're going to dive into the conversation that we have planned for today. As we mentioned, we're a workplace culture consulting practice, and we focus on equity and inclusion consulting in diverse workplaces. We do this through a number of focused areas, beginning with assessment and really leaning on those skills that Swati mentioned in survey research, organizational consulting, to really understand the nature of DEI issues in a given organization, because they're going to be different in every place. From there, helping organizations articulate their goals around these issues. For some workplaces, it might be a need to focus on inclusive culture. In others, it may be a focus on retention and growth of its staff. But it has to be tailored for each organization. From there, identifying the strategy for achieving those goals in targeted change model use to be able to identify what the most important issues are and how we get to achieve that change through transparency, accountability, data analysis, and really measuring where we are at the start and where we want to be as the process goes on. And throughout that entire process, we're looking at delivering the tools, the skills, and the norms that create an inclusive culture. As we know, you can have diversity all you want, but without inclusion, it's not going to stick. So really creating that capacity is very important. And that's what we do. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Swati to talk about the Mentimeter question.
So if you just joined after the start here, please take a moment to either use the QR code or visit the menti.com site and use the code to answer the question, are you going back full-time into the office, hybrid, not at all, no plans yet? We'll give you just a minute. The link to the site was also shared in the chat. While you're going ahead and filling that out, it might interest you to know that according to a recent Gartner poll of more than 200 respondents, they found that only 1% of mid-sized companies are planning on becoming fully remote organizations. And on the other hand of the spectrum, only 5% of mid-sized companies are planning on having all employees come back to the physical workplace. The remaining 94% will have some mix of in-office, remote, and hybrid employees. I tell you this to start to set the context of our discussion here.
Right, let's see, are folks having difficulties using the Mentimeter? So let me allow for the chat to work. You can share if you're having a difficulty using the slide. Yes, it links to a different survey. Okay, one moment and I'll make sure that you have the right details. You should have it there now. And I'm seeing folks be able to get that in there. Great. So as Swati is going to be talking through this, I will put up the data so that you can see what you and the other participants are doing when it comes to return to office.
So I think responses may still be coming in, but it does look like, based on what we're seeing here, again, there is more of a push towards that middle, that hybrid area that we're seeing. And so what that tells us, and here we go again, at the office full-time, work remotely full-time, those are like the two small ends of the spectrum. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about setting the context here of going into a situation that most of us are fairly unfamiliar with. Just pull up the slide here. You know, as Audrey is getting back into the slides, we want to start by stating very clearly upfront that we're not here to tell you what is the correct return to office strategy for your organization. Whatever path you choose, full return, hybrid, full remote, there are going to be obstacles, challenges, and adjustments. What we are here today to bring to light are some aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion that are not only significant in this process, but will actually support whichever strategy your company chooses. And we'll talk about how to add this DEI lens to your strategy and provide you with some tools and resources to do so. So what does a return to the office really mean? What's back to normal? Well, you never step in the same river twice, right? The river changes and we change. We can't go back to what it was because what we experienced in the last year and a half has forever changed our world. We saw global devastation as well as global resilience. We adjusted in ways we never thought possible. And we saw what employees, employers, teachers, students, parents, children can accomplish with enough creativity and technology. And now we're adjusting again. Not to a new normal, but as Audrey stated earlier, the next normal. If leaders consider that we have adjusted before and that we can adjust again, that small acknowledgement will benefit your organization no matter what strategy you choose. Just the idea that we are ever changing, ever evolving to what fits in a given time, that's what will bring out the best in your workforce. And that is the mindset that will bring your organization long-term success. So when we talk about a DEI lens, a robust lens will require continuous listening and dialogue, some creativity and flexibility, and a culture that includes everyone's needs. That's the key to retaining and engaging your workforce during this transition period. So let's chat for a minute about what some of the fallout of this pandemic has been on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Sure. So as you're looking at these headlines, I know that a lot of this is probably very familiar, right? If you're here with us today, you're probably already aware of these statistics. Looking at the jobs reports over the last year, we've seen some particularly devastating numbers in December. The December jobs report showed that men gained 16,000 jobs, while women lost 156,000. The nation's total net job loss for December was 140,000 jobs, all to women, most of whom, a disproportionately high number of whom, were women of color. And this is because these women were stuck between a rock and a hard place because of the pandemic, with schools closed and a lack of childcare, and in work that could not be done remotely or could not be done without access to transportation infrastructure that showed that it was difficult to get to a workplace. Those jobs were lost. And we see that over the course of that year, nearly 3 million women have dropped out of the labor force, all with devastating effects on how women are engaging in their careers, their ability to care for family, for themselves. And this is something that, as we're trying to tackle these issues, what we become aware of as this is happening is that we can't pretend that work and our personal life are distinct and that one can exist separate from the other. And that's a point that I was really glad to see. It was made by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. She was speaking in early May about the April jobs report. She said that our policymaking has not accounted for the fact that people's work lives and their personal lives are inextricably linked. And if one suffers, so does the other. And the pandemic has made that very clear. So Secretary Yellen was speaking with journalists about this in May, and we were seeing that the US economy had added only 266,000 jobs in April, and that was a very weak growth. So what happens is that women and caregivers were lacking support that really showed and highlighted this as an issue. Right. And we'll talk a little bit about this with the Mentimeter question that popped up for everyone first. But the idea that talking about one's personal life at work is somehow taboo, is a sign of weakness, is something that's not done, is a risk. And one thing that Swati and I feel very strongly about is that we need to make it possible for people to share the challenges that are happening outside of that work, those work hours and those work files that affect your ability to work. And that's really at the heart of what we do. We need you to have a workplace where you can thrive. And that means that if the question is who's going to pick up my kid from daycare, or how am I going to take care of my aging father, those are things that we need to be able to talk about. And as we're headed back into some form of seeing one another more regularly in a physical workspace, which I know I'm thrilled about, how we approach that, well, there are different ways to approach it. So Swati was mentioning some of the challenges in the DEI context, and we're taking two very high profile issues that have come up in the context of what a return to work might look like. And for any of you based in the Washington, D.C. area, you might have heard about Kathy Merrill as the Washingtonian CEO. Washingtonian Magazine, it's a lifestyle magazine for the Washington, D.C. area. And the CEO and president, Kathy Merrill, wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post earlier this spring. And you see here, as a CEO, I worry about the erosion of office culture with more remote work. There was a lot of fallout from this article. The actual op-ed initial title was, I want my employees to understand the risks of not returning to work in the office. So a lot of strong feelings there. And what Merrill said in her piece was that she estimates that 20% of an office job is outside of one's core responsibilities. Everything as varied as helping a colleague, celebrating someone's birthday that drives office culture. So something that I think is really important to talk about here is your organization has a culture, whether or not it has an office. How you treat people in all aspects of your work, from the way you sign off on emails, to how people participate in meetings, to whether people feel safe to talk about their needs outside of work, is part of your culture. So that was a big issue that came up with a very strong response to that by the workforce of Washingtonian, including going on strike following the publication of this op-ed, and labor organizing. So one of the things that we're going to talk about and recommend is in direct response to these issues, really taking the temperature of the folks that you work with. And then there's this comment from the CEO of WeWork saying that you can determine who your most engaged employees are, and those are the ones who want to come back to the office. And that begs the question, why does someone want to come back to the office? What limitations might there be that are outside of individual control? What structural issues of equity come up when we're talking about whether you can get to the office? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Swati to talk a little bit about how you can take that into account.
So let's start with taking the temperature, as we called it. And again, we urge you not to assume that everything is back to those pre-pandemic norms for everyone, that returning to the office will be like an on-off switch, because for many folks, It'll be more like adjusting a dial. And if you're ready to be flexible, to be open to some trial and error, you'll find the right setting for your workforce. We were able to make things work despite a pandemic. How? We asked questions and then figured out solutions. And that's the right answer now too. Ask. Do a survey. Ask your people what are the most important needs versus would be nice to haves, recognizing that you can't do it all, but you're going to try with their input. And that doesn't mean that you're turning into a consensus-driven organization, a consensus decision-driven organization. It just means that you're an organization that listens and cares. There are several great online examples for a return to work survey, and we're providing a short template today with some best of items that are a great basic starting point for you. But again, tailor it, tweak it to what your needs are as an organization. And finally, whatever you decide, be deliberate in your communication. Summarize your survey findings, show people that you listen to them, and then provide clear expectations about your return model. Articulate why you chose what you did. People want to feel heard and consulted, especially about decisions that will impact them. But they also need clarity and guidance. And again, every organization is different. So there's no one best way to communicate on this topic, but this would be the time to rally your top communication experts to pull together this very important messaging, as well as identifying a go-to person or a team for handling questions and concerns or misinformation. And the last piece of advice here in this listening process is to use empathy. We have this note, as well as a few others in this discussion, highlighted in orange because it specifically reflects a skill that builds inclusive culture. As a reminder, empathy is the capacity to understand what another person is experiencing from within their frame of reference. It's a key component of emotional intelligence, and it supports leaders in developing and retaining top talent. Empathy might shed light on disparities that you weren't even aware existed.
One of the things that you might find out as you're asking these questions of folks is something that we mentioned a little bit earlier. As you're taking this gathering information from your colleagues. What we're sharing here is from the Instagram account called Change the Museum, which describes itself as pressuring US museums to move beyond lip service proclamations by amplifying tales of unchecked racism. And what this post focuses on is at the Getty in Los Angeles. The location of the Getty is in two affluent neighborhoods, Brentwood and Malibu. And what that can mean for folks who work at the museum is that they can have an incredibly long commute. This person notes 2 to 4 hours one way. And it's incredibly important as you're going back to the possibility of the office, thinking about what that can look like for everyone. Do you want to take that into account? Is it something that's important to the folks you work with? What are you gaining as you ask folks to come back into the office? What might you be losing? Something else along those lines about what you're hearing, what you're thinking, is a question about what you want to keep. What did you learn from the pandemic that you want to hold on to? And this example might be pretty far afield unless you think you still have a shot at Major League Baseball. Maybe you do. But Major League Baseball cut double headers to 7 innings a game during the pandemic. And the justification was to limit possible exposure to COVID, right? And 18 innings for a doubleheader, you know, folks here are familiar with baseball, 9 innings a game, doubleheader would then be 18 innings. That's a lot of baseball, right? 14 innings is another story. And there are a lot of folks, and as this Tribune headline says, it looks like it might be here to stay. But at the same time, the questions that come up are, how do we record that? Does a 7-inning win count the same as a 9-inning win? What about a 7-inning no-hitter? Is that a no-hitter? Randy Johnson said it is not. And we can all understand why Randy Johnson might feel that way. But let's say something that he did say in response was that let's play 9 innings. Isn't that the way the game is meant to do and has been done for the last 100 years? And the question that we want to ask is, just because it's been done that way, does that mean that's the way we should do it in the future? And that really raises some questions for us, right? So we want to think, what have we identified that we want to be able to keep going forward? What do we want to change? And we are going to share some information from a recent and great article in Harvard Business Review about changes that we might want to adopt that we gained during the pandemic. And some of these recommendations focused on identifying which practices were successful, why they were successful, and how they might continue to succeed in this new next normal. And then really thinking about what we might do to change the way things were done before the pandemic began, and really think about unlearning practices that might have been dysfunctional. The focus on questioning and reconsidering how our workplaces functioned. It might be our spatial arrangements, right? How many days we're in the office and so on. The questions that we want to think about then really rely on change management principles. We want to discuss and resolve disagreements, misconceptions about what these new procedures might look like, so that we're in a place where people really are able to focus on that change when they come back in and really rely on that 7-inning doubleheader, whatever it might be for you in your office. Swati?
And I mean, when we talk about change is scary, change is overwhelming, and change is really hard to start and continue and push on your own. And you have at your disposal an incredible and probably diverse talent pool whose input would be very helpful at this time, because everybody went through different things, because everybody has something probably beneficial to share. So we want to go to our next Mentimeter question here and ask you, how comfortable are you talking with your boss about your personal life needs and how they affect your work? We'll take a minute here.
We'll pull up that question for you. Okay. Great. All right. Share that.
We have a nice, comfortable set of people here. That's great. And what that tells us is, you've got a safe culture where you feel like you can speak up. We have a few neutral responses here, but we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when people don't feel safe, when people aren't ready to have those candid conversations. There's some good strategies to make sure that your culture does feel safe and open and honest for everybody. So let's talk about how we get ready for those candid conversations. If you really want your employees to be candid in their feedback to you, you need to first and foremost foster psychological safety, which is the belief that one can speak up without a risk of punishment or humiliation. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. We're also going to take a look briefly at the psychological conditions that promote and sustain employee engagement. Audrey mentioned a little bit earlier the quote by the WeWork CEO talking about only those people who are planning to come into the office are the truly engaged ones. Well, I come from a background of employee engagement consulting, and I'm here to tell you that's not the case. We'll touch on policy and workplace culture, keeping in mind that leaders and managers need to set the tone for these conversations so that everyone feels comfortable to use this opportunity to communicate their needs honestly and openly. And finally, we'll end with some key takeaways and resources to support both managers and direct reports throughout this process. So let's talk a little bit about psychological safety in the workplace. Now, when this safety is present, your colleagues feel included, they feel safe to make mistakes, safe to contribute, and to speak up, all without a fear that others on the team will embarrass, reject, or punish them for doing so. Most researchers, DEI researchers, business leaders agree that organizations benefit from a diversity of thought. But according to a 2017 Gallup poll, 3 out of 10 employees strongly agreed that their opinions at work don't count. That's a lot of missing valuable perspectives. Innovative ideas, problems you aren't aware of, creative solutions. When there's a lack of psychological safety in your workplace and people don't feel comfortable to share what they think, your organization is ill-equipped to prevent failures. And you're losing opportunities to leverage the strengths of your entire talent pool. So what can you do? As a leader or a people manager, or even as a colleague, leaders and managers need to start by explicitly talking about the need for psychological safety in your workplace as an organizational benefit. Tie it to your goals and values, whether those are innovation, building engagement, diversity and inclusion. Next, and this is really for everyone, facilitate everyone speaking up. You know when the same 3 people keep talking in meeting after meeting. Ask pointed questions. Encourage group brainstorms. If you're the talker, make space for others. And if you rarely speak up, find a way to make your voice heard. And again, keeping empathy in mind all the while. If you want people to be brave, you have to truly approach things with an open mind and try to see their perspectives, even if they don't align with your own. When mistakes happen, and they will happen, don't punish or blame. Use mistakes as springboards for learning and growth. Otherwise, you'll be squashing innovation instead of encouraging it. And finally, embrace conflict that is productive. If you want your workforce to engage in some reasonable risk-taking, they have to feel like your responses will be accepting, not critical. Again, when we get to the resources that we'll be sharing, we have a wonderful one from the Center for Creative Leadership that has much, much more on the topic of psychological safety. And now to my old friend, employee engagement. Most of you, I'm sure, have participated in an employee engagement survey at your workplace. And many of you may have also worked on actions to improve engagement, whether that's team-wide or firm-wide. When William Kahn coined the term employee engagement, he described 3 psychological conditions that went into this personal workplace engagement or disengagement. First, meaningfulness. Does an employee find their work meaningful enough to warrant them engaging their full self? 2, safety. Does the employee feel safe bringing their full self to work without risk of negative consequences? And 3, availability. Does the employee feel mentally and physically able to harness their full self at this particular moment? Let's start with the first one. The pandemic has impacted many people's worldview and what they find meaningful. For example, the ability to work from home has allowed for much better work-life balance for some people. For others, It's made that balance much worse. Americans are leaving jobs by the millions, looking for higher wages, better benefits, and greater purpose. According to the Labor Department, the retail industry alone saw 649,000 resignations in April. That is the most resignations in a given month in the past 20 years. And as one young worker in Tennessee put it, my life isn't worth a dead-end job. But not all of these departures are due to cognitive shifts. Many people cited loving their retail jobs, the ability to interact with live people, often a laid-back environment, being able to get creative to help customers. But they've had to leave because of pandemic-related challenges. Lack of public transportation, finding reliable childcare. This is where asking about and addressing the needs of your engaged workforce will help you retain the right talent moving forward. Otherwise, even the employees who haven't left may end up doing so soon. Regarding the condition of safety, we just talked about psychological safety, but the pandemic has also brought about implications for the physical health safety of employees. We know that not everyone is choosing to get the vaccine or have young children at home who cannot, that some people are much more vulnerable with the virus's impact or live with other people who are. The level of stress that such anxiety adds to one's job can be crippling. It can only benefit your organization to ask your employees how they're feeling about this. Even small modifications in your physical office space may alleviate some of this stress. And to really harness their full contributions, ask your employees for their suggested solutions as well. What are some things that would make them feel more comfortable coming back into the office space? And finally, we look at availability. We look at how burnout impacts employees' mental and/or physical ability to engage in their jobs. Pandemic burnout is real, and numerous outlets are talking about the toll that the past 15 months has taken on employees. Just 2 days ago, an article in the Washington Post economy section discussed that those companies willing to identify and address this burnout with tools and resources to combat it are going to be the most successful in retaining engaged employees. This is the time and place to ask questions about how people are doing and feeling. The time to remind them about your paid leave policy and not just say take a few days off, but to truly encourage it without any repercussions. If losing an essential worker for 1 week means you not only retain that employee, but bring back a colleague who's refreshed, isn't it worth it? This is also the time to communicate about other benefits, perhaps your EAP, child or elder care savings, flexible schedules. Again, ask, creatively problem solve, and communicate. These are the keys to keeping your employees engaged.
It's interesting that you mentioned the taking time off and really meaning it. We've had a few discussions recently with some of our clients and with folks we work with about workplaces that are saying we are shutting down for a week, 10 days, an extended vacation for next week, right? So it's not just you can take vacation days, but it's you send an email, no one's going to respond. There's no one there. And if you take a moment to just think about what that might feel like for yourself, what really shutting off of work would feel like, it probably seems like it would feel really good right about now, right?
It's like a power nap for your organization.
I like that, power nap. Let's talk also about, and I love these conditions for employee engagement, thinking about also how we put that into practice, right? Safety, meaningfulness, and that building that sense of availability will grow from the culture and the policies that you put into place, right? So those are things that we want to give a lot of thought to, and we can come up with solutions that are creative, that are as creative as we had at the beginning of the pandemic, right? I know everyone on this call had to take huge efforts to put into practice what their workplace would look like during March of 2020. And we want to bring that same kind of creative problem solving and looking for solutions at this stage of the pandemic as well. What we saw was that we got a window into one another's lives, and we can't pretend we didn't see it. Some people were left behind. We need to use this to expand our definitions of work and life and how people get the job done. We want to think about the ways in which policies and practices that have been in place might have reinforced inequitable practices. For instance, the old way might have required FaceTime. I know that that's certainly something that I felt when I was a first few years in a job as an attorney in New York City. Being physically present in the office more than 12 hours a day was a given. And we're seeing from what Swati mentioned about how people are leaving jobs that are not meaningful to them. That FaceTime is not what they're looking to deliver. And it's not what means what delivers outcomes. And being outcome focused in this stage is really important. Similarly, engaging people in the process whom you may not have thought to engage. And that can mean folks who are not at the top of the organization, folks who are differently situated within the organization, to be able to get their input on policy changes. Right? That goes to the survey, the asking questions, and understanding what that looks like. Next, when it comes to policies, is that time and money and energy can sometimes be substituted for one another. So if we're looking to ask what's needed and how it can be delivered, can we adjust our hours as a policy? That's great. If you can't, can we support with childcare cost reimbursements or stipends? Is transportation access an issue like we talked about before? Hybrid model can provide support for that when not everyone is trying to get into the office at perhaps 9 a.m., right? And noting that flexibility is for everyone. That's not just people with caretaking obligations, right? So management practices also need to take into account how to work in this hybrid environment. So we mentioned before about the resources we'll be sharing, and we're going to share a great one, again, from Harvard Business Review on how we make a hybrid workplace fair. And having had pre-pandemic experience with the distributed workforce at a small nonprofit based in New York City, you're really putting forward some things that might be taken for granted when you're in the same physical space together. It's noting where power dynamics affect individuals in the workplace, because some folks are in the office and seen and being talked about, and some folks aren't. Right? And we don't want that to damage relationships or impede effective collaboration. It's truly important to be able to take that into account so that we know how to tackle these issues. And that can mean monitoring how these changes are going in the workplace. It means identifying what the issues are, where this is most likely to come up as a problem, looking at performance reviews or evaluations, the launch of a new team, onboarding. And there are certainly ways that we're able to put these practices into place in a distributed environment. And for instance, ours is distributed at Mariana Strategies, and we take efforts to ensure that we spend time getting to know one another and ensuring that we have that inclusive culture where we can build that psychological safety in the workplace. Swati, do you want to talk to us about some takeaways?
Yes, absolutely. Empathy, psychological safety, conditions for building engagement, none of these has a magic formula. They have to be tailored to the people and the culture in your organization. But as with most things, our suggestions today are guidelines to move you in the right direction. So what are the big takeaways? Get input from your teams. about what is most important to them. Be ready for those candid conversations and model the behaviors that you are hoping to see. Focus on what you can do. Be transparent and articulate the reasons for the choices that you're making. And recognize that this is the next normal, not the final one. You've made adjustments before. You can continue to make adjustments until you find the right key.
That's hugely important. And we don't want to leave you with just ideas, but not tools. And that's why we've put together a sample return to office survey, which we'll send you after our call today. And the same with our return to office planning checklist for conversations going in both directions. So both the conversations that you want to have with your direct reports and the one that you need to have with your supervisor. And then finally, we're always here to talk about anything that might be more in the weeds, anything that we can do to support when it comes to inclusive culture and consulting. So those are some important things that we wanted to make sure that we shared. We also want to think about what people need when it comes to putting these issues into practice. And that's why we're also sharing the articles that we mentioned.
And I know we're coming to the end of the hour. We do want to make some time for questions, but very quickly, just wanted to yet again remind everybody about our upcoming Lunch and Learn sessions. July 22nd, Beginner Strategies for Building a More Inclusive Workplace. August 12th, Inclusive Leadership Strategies, What Leaders Need to Know. September 2nd, Handling Blind Spots. I don't know how to talk about race at work. You can register for any and all of these at marianastrategies.com. And again, thank you on behalf of Audrey and myself for joining us today. We're happy to stick around for questions. And if you don't mind sticking around just for a few seconds, we will also be sharing a link to a survey for you to let us know how we did today.
Yes.
If you don't have time to stick around to ask a question, you can also email us at any of the emails that we had provided or separately, respectively.
Yes, let's take a little time now to go through some questions. So we're seeing here, I love, there's a point that Roberta made in the chat a while back. For how many organizations is this actually a change? Some workplaces were already hybrid. And I'm so glad you made that point, Roberta, because this is still an opportunity to take into account how the pandemic has affected our workplaces. So while some may be continuing their hybrid status, it's always a good time to think about what equity and inclusion looks like in this next normal. One question we received in advance today was, how can hybrid teams create more equitable and inclusive hybrid meetings? And does that mean all employees should call into a virtual staff meeting instead of having some meet together in person and some Skype in together? And that way that playing field is more evened out. Is that the best practice? I'm going to toss in the suggestion, and I know Swati has an opinion about this. I think it depends on what technology you have available. Having come from a small nonprofit, scrappy nonprofit, I don't think we had the same technology tools that Swati did at her huge international consulting firm to make sure that folks who participated remotely got the same experience as the ones who were in the office. But why don't you tell us what you think the answer to that is, Swati?
I'm actually going to start by addressing both questions, the one that was earlier in the chat as well. The concept that, there were workplaces that previously were already hybrid, that's true. However, even for many of those people, situations changed during those past 15 months. when you had spouses that were also working from home simultaneously. You had limited technology resources when your children were also schooling from home. So again, making sure that you check in with those people who, even though you know have always worked from home and or had that hybrid capability, that they feel empowered still to continue to be engaged in their jobs, and or checking in to see what else they may need. So that's one note I wanted to make. And yes, as far as how to handle those hybrid meetings, I think again, the best place to start is to first ask your teams what they would prefer. Secondly, I would say that flexibility piece is really important. I know that at my consulting firm, we were constantly in the habit of having, oftentimes in the tens, sometimes hundreds of people joining certain calls. And the flexibility came around, even if you were in the office, it depended on your work style. It depended on what you had going on that day. You could take the call from your desk, or you might want to come in and join the greater team sitting in one room together because you wanted to engage in that eye contact and that in-person interaction that existed. So just being able to be flexible and knowing that things are dynamic in this process. They're going to be changing, and if we want to be inclusive and we want to continue to provide that same equitable process for everybody, we just need to make sure that we're giving everybody the same options.
That's great. And we've got another question in the chat here. Do we have advice for an organization that has already collected the feedback on return to office, but missed the mark on communicating the findings and plan to return? What's the saying, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago and the second best time is today? Even if you didn't get it perfectly right first go around, it is completely appropriate to say, we heard you. We're taking into account the feedback on return to office, and we are going to do this as an iterative process. Just like we ensured that we were checking in March, April, through the summer last year, into the winter, and now where we are today, noting that it's a process and that you're going to continue to take information into account and adjust accordingly. Swati, what would you add?
The only other thing I would add is that starting the communication now, continuing the communication, a lot of employees throughout the pandemic have noted that over communication was better in these situations. So yeah, as Audrey mentioned, continue listening, continue communicating. If you miss the mark, just look forward.
Great. Any other questions? We still have a few minutes if you do. And we have enabled video in case you want to ask. Unmute yourself. All right. Well, as we're finishing up, we want to thank you so much for joining us today. And we are so thrilled that this is a topic that's important to you. Swati, any last words?
Yeah, we hope to see you again in our next session. Thank you, everyone.
Absolutely. Have a good Thursday.